Hey, welcome back. Today I'm doing my third video on how to play chess. The first one, we covered the rules and how the pieces move. And the second one, I covered opening principles, like controlling the center, developing your pieces, castling, getting your king to safety, connecting the rooks, and so on. This video is more about what's next. A lot of advice that some beginners get, especially when they ask for it on forums, on websites, or to work on some of these things. Or these are ideas that they come up with, and that's the question. Should you study next book openings or work on tactics and puzzles, end game scenarios? Like, really, what's next? Aside from just playing lots of games and analyzing them. But my answer for myself was, why not all of it? Like, let's work on this stuff. I bought a book on book openings and started studying them. Some of the most common ones, according to a few searches I ran, are the Ruy Lopez, the Italian Game, all these listed here. Sicilian Defense, French Defense, Caro-Kann. I used to pronounce that Perk, but I believe it's Peart's Defense. Queen's Gambit, various Indian defenses, and so on. And each of these have many branches and variations. That's one thing you can study, and then you will start recognizing those on the board or when you're watching World Championship chess. The upside is it streamlines your first few moves. Each of these openings have been designed over years, in some cases centuries, to result in a solid position. They're designed to control the center, to protect pieces, to put pieces on active optimal squares, protect your king, and so on. Now the downside, and this is a big one that a lot of people, including me, didn't realize when they first started studying openings, is that a lot of them, if not most of them, depend on what the other player does. So you can't just study the Sicilian defense and then there you go, because the other player might not play into it. Just as a quick example, I'm going to switch to an analysis board here. If you want to play, say, the Ruy Lopez, that's this. Black responds, knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5. All the Ruy Lopez variations start from this position or very close, sometimes in a slightly different order, and then go from there. Now, if you back up just a little bit, black might not play this move to open, and then you can't play the Ruy Lopez. If they play this, you can't play the Ruy Lopez. This is the Caro-Kann. If instead they play this pawn to c5, you're in the Sicilian defense. It's entirely different. If you keep trying to play the Ruy Lopez, they're going to do something different. And this is still the Sicilian, no matter what you want. Or, let's flip this board. And as black, let's say you study the Caro-Kann, which is this here, and usually something like this. And you start practicing variations like the exchange variation or the advanced variation. But white doesn't have to play this first. They might play this first, and then you can't play the Caro-Kann. It doesn't work. Or the Sicilian, for that matter. That's a huge downside, in my opinion, to learning specific openings, especially at the beginning, because you might not get that opening every time that you want it. And but the advice that I've taken and would easily give out to anyone else is that it can't hurt to become mildly familiar with those most common openings, because of that upside that they streamline your first few moves. Also, you start to recognize them on the board. Then you start to learn what the ideas of each of the openings are. You learn that the Sicilian tries to control the center with a flank pawn, or at least prevent white from controlling the entire center, and so on. But sure, take a look. There's books you can buy. Both, all of the chess websites that I've seen have opening explorers and databases you can look through. Plus, I mean, Wikipedia has a bunch of those openings listed along with their ideas. When it comes to tactics, most people mean puzzles, puzzle solving, but these tactics exist outside of puzzles, and that's the reason they're handy to learn. forks and skewers and pins, passed pawns, what to do with them, how to handle exchanges and sacrifices, and so on. The upside to learning these is that these are common chess ideas and patterns. They show up in games. I see pinned pieces in almost every game. There's exchanges in almost every game and sacrifices. And if you make it far enough, there's going to be a passed pawn. And then basic checkmate patterns you need to know. It's important. Now, the downside, in my opinion, to learning them with puzzles is that the hugest downside for me is very often, even the easiest puzzles, they start off in a position that looks unfamiliar because you haven't played the game up to that point. And it takes a while to look and see where your king is, where the opponent's king is, whether or not you have checks and so on. Because if you've been playing the game from the beginning, you've put those pieces there intentionally, and you know why you put them there, and you watched your opponent move their pieces into position. So you, at that point, should already be aware of all the threats. That makes puzzles a little unnatural compared to gameplay. And what I've been doing is just taking my time, trying to understand those positions and the outcomes, and along the way, I'm learning about pins and skewers and all these other things I listed here. Simplification is something I've been practicing recently. Basically, once you're up on material, or even if you're kind of even on material and you're pretty sure you have an advantage, once you clear off some of those pieces, you can trade a knight for a knight and a bishop for a bishop, a rook for a rook on your own terms to basically clear the board. Then your advantage becomes more apparent. End games is, I see this recommendation from more advanced players a lot. Study your end games. There's certainly a lot of it to study, but I guess a lot of beginner games don't really make it to the end game. There's usually a checkmate right in the middle someplace. Somebody hangs a piece and resigns. But it's important to know these things because they come in really handy if you ever make it to the end game. And increasingly, you will find yourself making it to the end game. The more that you're paired with players at your level, you end up exchanging off pieces and maneuvering, and you realize it's just a king and some pawns. Now what do I do? And that's why it's important to study various endgame scenarios. One downside is that, at least for me, some of these endgames are a lot more complicated than they appear. They'll just be 3 or 4 pawns on each side and a king on each side. And it turns out that you have to play perfectly for that to be a drawn endgame or a winning endgame or to avoid the loss. Sometimes it requires your opponent to blunder in order for you to gain an advantage. But I've been trying to learn the most common checkmate patterns. I internalized very early the rules of stalemating when you don't have a legal move, but you're not in check. So that I, on more than one occasion, tricked an opponent into stalemating me when I was clearly behind. And one reason, let me switch to a different screen and show you, well, that doesn't look right. There, that looks better. This is an end game of sorts. You're even on material. Each side has 4 pawns. Nobody has a passed pawn yet. I've got a bishop. The opponent has a knight. And we each have a king. Completely even. Looks like. But when I turn on Stockfish in this position, it says white has a significant advantage. If it's white's turn. I honestly didn't check to see what the advantage was if it's black's turn. And that might make a huge difference. That's one thing I've noticed while studying endgames. And often, depending on the position, it makes a huge difference whose turn it is. For example, if this is white's turn, I believe white is supposed to almost immediately go after this pawn in order to use this pawn as an advantage. While black is supposed to try something like this, to try to get their own passed pawn. If they move the A pawn forward, if white captures, well, if white doesn't capture, then they just have a passed pawn. If white does capture, black can capture back and has a passed pawn that they can protect with the king or the knight. Well, not immediately because of the bishop. But anyway, you kind of get the idea. They can get complicated. But yeah, Stockfish says this is a plus 3.7. for white, but I wouldn't have known that just from looking at the position. But anyway, I want to go back to the beginning here of this little slideshow. These are some ideas, things that you can do if you plan to get better. But again, aside from playing regular games of different varying time controls, I prefer longer ones, but if you like Bullet or Blitz, more power to you. And then analyze those games afterwards, try to figure out where your mistakes came. And why is the engine suggesting that here I should have sacrificed this piece, and so on. But learn a few openings, learn the major ones, figure out what their ideas are, so you'll recognize those patterns, realize, oh, in this position, I'm supposed to be fighting for the e5 square, or in this position, I'm supposed to be taking the center with a flank pawn, or whatever it is. Practice your tactics, your puzzles, learn those basic common ideas, and look at endgame scenarios. If you make it to an endgame and you have a few basic ideas and your opponent doesn't, you automatically have an advantage. Hopefully this has been helpful. I don't think it was too long. I think I covered some significant material here. If you have any questions or it's something to teach me, feel free to leave a comment. Thank you.